Ladies and gentlemen, they said she didn't belong there. Just a girl on the sidelines, quietly picking up spent shell casings after the big boys had their fun. No rank. No stripes. Just routine. But fate doesn't care about ranks. Because one man, an elite special forces sniper, saw something in her stance, her silence, her aura. And with a smirk, he issued a challenge, a 3,285-yard shot. The kind of shot that changes reputations or destroys them. What happened next didn't just echo across the range, it silenced the entire base. Today, I want to tell you what happened after that challenge. Not just a shot, but a moment that shattered every expectation ever written about her. This is her story. She arrived on the range like she always did, quietly, almost invisibly. No commanding presence. No striking uniform that shouted power. Just standard fatigues, dusted boots, and a duffel that clinked faintly with spent brass. She was there to pick up after the show was over. The clatter after the thunder. The kind of job no one volunteers for but someone has to do. And for as long as anyone could remember, she was that someone. Efficient. Discreet. Unbothered by the grime, the noise, the stares. To the others, she was background noise, part of the cleanup crew, not part of the war machine. Soldiers rarely acknowledged her presence. When they passed her on their way to the firing line, eyes locked forward, there was no nod, no glance, just boots trampling dust. She was the one who crouched in the corners, crawling along the edge of the range like a ghost, her gloved fingers gathering the empty shell casings one by one, like pieces of someone else's glory. They never noticed her posture. How she held the rounds in her hand. How her fingers traced them with a familiarity that didn't belong to someone merely cleaning up. They didn't catch the way she scanned the distant landscape, not like a janitor scanning for trash, but like a hawk searching for angles. She didn't carry a clipboard, but she remembered everything: calibers, trajectories, rhythms. She could tell who had a shaky trigger finger just by the scatter pattern of the brass. She could identify the overconfident from the way their shells bunched too tightly near the bench. No one knew that. No one asked. Her routine was predictable, and predictability breeds invisibility. While others laughed, boasted, and packed up their gear with exaggerated swagger, she moved through the residue of their confidence in silence. She heard the jokes. She heard the names, Ammo Girl, Brass Rat, Tagalong. None of them stuck to her skin. She wasn't there for approval. But every comment, every sideways glance, every dismissal, it all sank somewhere deeper than the surface. Not as wounds, but as data points. Things to remember. Some of the younger recruits whispered that she had been around too long for someone not in the game. Others speculated that maybe she was a volunteer, someone who got left behind by time, by war, by someone important. A kind of relic in boots. None of them asked her. None of them tried. The range itself was a sacred place to some, a proving ground to others. And yet, there she was, day after day, moving through the sacred space like she didn't belong, except she moved like she did. She didn't flinch at the gunfire. She didn't blink at the echoes. Her hands were steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon, not the noise behind her. There was something unnerving about how composed she remained when others crumbled under pressure. But because she wasn't one of them, they chalked it up to ignorance, not strength. They didn't know that composure wasn't just muscle memory. It was something learned, something earned, and in her case, something remembered. She had once stepped onto a different kind of range, in a different kind of uniform. But that was long ago. Or maybe not so long. No one could be sure. The paperwork didn't say much. She kept it that way. Her past wasn't a story, it was a tool. Hidden in plain sight, just like she was. So she remained in the shadows of their stories, picking up the leftovers, observing the noise, memorizing the patterns. Always silent. Always steady. And still, not a single one of them asked the question that mattered. Why is she really here? It was supposed to be another routine day. The sun baked the dirt range into a sheet of heat waves, and the air crackled with gunfire in intervals. Shells hit the ground with familiar metallic clinks, echoing the same rhythm she'd heard 1,000 times. The others were packing up after their precision drills, chests puffed with pride, weapons slung over their shoulders like trophies. She was already moving along the edge of the range, stooping to collect brass, her canvas bag slowly filling as she worked in practiced silence. He had been watching her for a while, longer than she noticed. Tall, sharp, calm in the way only someone who had seen too much could be. His uniform bore the subdued patch of a special forces unit, the kind only whispered about in the barracks. Not much was known about him except that he didn't miss. He wasn't loud, didn't gloat, didn't mix with the others unless absolutely necessary. His name carried weight, but his voice rarely carried past a few feet. When he spoke, people listened. When he walked past, people got out of the way. She didn't look up when he approached. Not at first. She was focused on a cluster of casings near the edge of a worn-out mat. But she felt his presence before she saw him. Heavy-rooted, calm like a sniper waiting for breath to steady. She glanced up only for a second and met his eyes. Not curious, not surprised. Just steady. Measured. He didn't smirk. He didn't taunt. But there was a question in his look, not one that needed words. Then, finally, he broke the silence, not with condescension, not with amusement, but with challenge. Think you could hit something from 3285? The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. The others nearby turned their heads, some with confusion, others with barely hidden grins. She was just the shell girl after all. What kind of question was that? She didn't answer right away. She stood up slowly, brushing the dust from her gloves. Her eyes didn't waver from his. There was no bravado in her stance, no shift in posture to indicate offense or anxiety. Just awareness. Calculated. She didn't look away. He stepped aside and motioned toward the setup behind him, his personal rifle, a modified .338 Lapua, mounted perfectly, scope gleaming under the sun. Not a range toy. Not a training weapon. This was a sniper's instrument, tuned like a violin, deadly as memory. The others started to circle, sensing something out of place. Someone whispered her nickname. Someone else laughed under their breath. But the sniper didn't laugh. He simply waited, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Not mocking her, testing her. She moved forward with slow steps, measured but confident. Her boots crunched the gravel, and the whispers started to trail off. When she reached the rifle, she didn't ask for permission. She didn't hesitate. She ran her fingers along the scope like she had touched it before, like muscle memory returning after a long rest. The sniper raised a brow, the smallest hint of intrigue on his face. He hadn't expected that. Not exactly. The wind began to shift, a low breeze curling through the range. It was the kind of subtle change only snipers noticed, those who lived in the space between breath and bullet. She adjusted the elevation dial slightly, then the windage. No show, no commentary. Just calculation. Precision. The crowd around them began to grow, murmurs rising. The idea that someone like her, quiet, overlooked, unranked, might even touch that rifle, let alone fire it, was becoming something of a spectacle. The kind of moment that either becomes a joke or a legend. And standing beside her, the sniper waited to see which one it would become. The .338 Lapua Magnum was no beginner's round. Designed for extreme-range precision shooting, it carried enough power to maintain lethal velocity well beyond what most marksmen ever dared to attempt. Hitting a target at 3,285 yards wasn't just a flex, it was a physics problem. A brutal one. At that distance, even the Earth's curvature began to matter. Wind wasn't just a factor, it was a wall. Humidity, altitude, barrel temperature, mirage, all of it needed to be accounted for. That kind of shot didn't belong in the realm of guesswork or luck. It belonged to professionals. or legends. She lay prone behind the rifle, body aligned with the barrel, every inch of her form settled into a practiced stillness. No wasted motion. No nervous fidgeting. Just calm. Her finger hovered above the trigger like it had a memory of its own. Around her, a hush began to settle over the crowd of soldiers, instructors, and observers who had gathered in a loose semicircle. Some had arms crossed skeptically, others leaned forward, waiting for the moment to fall apart. The sniper stood just behind her, arms folded, eyes narrowed, not in mockery, but in calculation. He had seen plenty of good shooters. He had trained with some of the best. But even they knew that 3,285 yards was the kind of distance that required more than skill. It demanded patience, poise, and something deeper, something you couldn't teach. She adjusted the scope incrementally, dialing in numbers with mechanical precision. The target was a steel plate, painted white, placed against a dark earthen berm. At this distance, it was barely a speck to the naked eye. Even through high-powered optics, the plate shimmered with heat haze. The mirage made the air ripple like waves on water, distorting the visual path between her and the shot. She paused and tilted her head slightly. The wind had shifted. Not a gust, not a roar, just a subtle whisper brushing across her cheek. She adjusted for it. She remembered how the air behaved out here. She could read the wind by the way the grass bent on the horizon, by the heat shimmer dancing off the dust. It wasn't just observation. It was instinct built over years of silence. The spectators began to murmur. Some whispered bets. Others scoffed. One or two had started recording on their phones, hoping to catch the moment the shot missed because missing was the expected outcome. Most of them had never even attempted that kind of distance. And those who had tried? They knew what kind of discipline it required just to land close. She breathed out slowly, letting her chest fall. She didn't inhale again. Snipers fire in the pause between breaths, when the heart is the only thing moving. And even that needs to be ignored. She waited for her pulse to slow 1 beat, 2, 3. The trigger pull was smooth, without jerk or jolt. The rifle kicked back with a sharp recoil, but her body absorbed it like she'd done it 1,000 times. The report of the rifle cracked through the air, a deep, echoing punch that rolled over the range like a thunderclap. And then, silence. Time seemed to stretch. At that distance, the bullet needed seconds to reach the target. It traveled over 2 miles of open space, slicing through wind corridors, fighting gravity, whispering past invisible currents. The watchers strained their eyes, some scanning the target zone, others watching her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked to the scope. Not searching for validation. Just observing. Calculating. Waiting for a result she already knew how to read. The sound was faint, almost easy to miss. A distant metallic ping that floated back across the range, delayed by seconds that felt like hours. It was subtle, but unmistakable, the sound of a bullet striking steel at extreme range. For those who recognized it, it hit harder than any explosion. The crowd, still murmuring, went suddenly quiet. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Every pair of binoculars and scopes confirmed the same thing: impact. The steel target, painted white, now bore a fresh, dark blemish dead near center. It wasn't a near miss. It wasn't luck. It was a clean, disciplined shot from over 3,200 yards. For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She stayed prone, eyes still to the scope. There was no smile, no gasp of celebration. She simply blinked once, as if confirming a calculation. The rifle rested beside her like it had finally found the right hands again. The smell of spent powder hung in the air, sharp and bitter, but somehow clean. Someone dropped a water bottle. The clatter was loud in the silence. A few of the newer recruits exchanged glances. Others looked toward the sniper, expecting him to laugh, to wave it off, to say it was a fluke. But he didn't. His jaw was clenched, his eyes focused not on the target but on her. His expression wasn't confusion. It was recognition. He'd seen something like this once before, years ago maybe. In a different desert, with different uniforms. Someone had made a shot like that then. And now, the pieces started to fall into place. Not fully, but enough to know she wasn't who they thought she was. She stood slowly, dusting her knees without a word. Her eyes didn't seek the crowd. She didn't look for reactions or applause. She moved like someone who had done what she came to do. Like someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. Her movements were controlled, quiet, and unshaken. The whispers around her turned to hushed tones, reverent in a way that sounded almost fearful. Even the officers standing nearby had gone stiff, unsure how to react. No one knew her file. She didn't exist in their stories. Not until now. A few people pulled their phones away, unsure if they were supposed to be recording anymore. It no longer felt like entertainment. It felt like witnessing something classified. The sniper finally stepped forward. His boots moved slower than usual, his body language stripped of its usual surety. He looked at her, really looked this time, not as the brass girl or the background helper, but as someone who just hit a shot most wouldn't even attempt. He didn't speak. He just gave a single, sharp nod. Not of approval, but of acknowledgement. As if to say, I see it now. She returned the nod, subtle and short. A mutual understanding passed between them. There was no handshake. No dramatic salute. Just silence. The others began to shift. Some backed away, unsure what they had just witnessed. Others lingered, hoping for some explanation, something to ground the moment in reality. But there was no speech. No name drop. No confirmation. The steel plate in the distance stood as the only witness, still ringing faintly in memory. And around it, the silence held heavier than before, less about what had happened, and more about who she really was. The ones who had laughed earlier now stood with folded arms, eyes cast downward. Not from shame, but from uncertainty. Because in that one shot, everything they thought they understood had been torn open. It wasn't until later, after the range had cleared, after the last brass was swept away, after the murmurs had softened into background noise, that someone finally asked the question that had been hanging unspoken in every mind. Who was she? The shot was undeniable. The math, the control, the poise under pressure, it didn't happen by chance. That kind of precision didn't belong to someone who learned by watching. It belonged to someone who had lived it. A few started digging, casually at first. A favor from a buddy in records, a harmless inquiry passed between departments. But her file was sealed, redacted in ways that usually only applied to people who had been somewhere and done something. There were gaps where there shouldn't have been. Service history that started and stopped with no explanation. Units listed as non-standard, with vague deployment codes that meant nothing to anyone outside the black tier circles. The deeper they looked, the more the trail vanished. Someone managed to trace an old deployment manifest, operation name classified, location classified. But one name stood out. A long-range engagement team embedded with a Tier 1 unit, notorious for its impossible shot confirmations. There had been rumors that one of their shooters wasn't listed on the books. No ID, no acknowledgement, but every operator in that unit deferred to them. Called them shadow scope. No one could confirm if it was her. No one could deny it either. The sniper who had issued the challenge said nothing publicly. But those close to him noticed a change. He stopped joking about the shot. He stopped referring to her as the brass girl. When he spoke about the range, his tone carried something different now, respect, and something heavier. Regret, maybe. Or realization. Stories began to circulate quietly. Things that never made it to official reports. An enemy general taken out from an impossible distance during a sandstorm. A convoy saved because someone eliminated a threat with a shot across a canyon. These were ghost stories among operators, passed around like myth. Everyone knew the shots had happened. No one knew who fired them. Or maybe they did, and just stopped talking. Back at the range, she kept to her routine. She still picked up shells, still walked the lines after the firing stopped. But now, people watched her differently. Not with derision, but caution. Officers made space when she passed. Recruits quieted down when she was within earshot. Some tried to approach her, to ask questions, to draw out details. She gave them the same silence she always had. Those who trained in ballistics began reviewing her adjustments on the scope, recreating the exact windage and elevation she used. It matched textbook precision. Beyond textbook, actually adjusted for microenvironmental anomalies that only experienced field snipers would recognize. Things like pressure drift from a moving heat front, minor elevation drops due to terrain changes no one even noticed until she compensated for them. The instructors at the base didn't speak her name during formal lectures, but they started referencing her shot in training hypotheticals. They turned it into a lesson not just in skill, but in perception. How you never really know who's watching, or what they've seen. Rumors about her began to evolve. No longer just the girl at the range, she became a presence. Some said she had once trained with the best snipers in the world. Others claimed she had outshot them. There was talk of a classified list, the few people alive who had successfully hit a target beyond 3,000 yards in real-world conditions. A list only whispered about in certain circles. And now her name was being added. Not officially, but whispered. Passed between those who understood what that meant. The shot didn't just leave a mark on the steel target, it carved a name into the unspoken hierarchy of the base. In the world of elite shooters, there were no certificates, no trophies, no official announcements. There were only reputations, built quietly, sustained through whispers, and sealed by acts so precise they didn't need validation. After that day, her name, though few actually knew it, was no longer a side note. It became a caution, a benchmark, a ghost that walked among them. She hadn't said much since the shot. She never did. But silence had become her signature. While others debriefed loudly, exaggerating drills and inflating numbers, she moved through spaces like a shadow present, but not always noticed until it was too late. That kind of presence was earned, built over time and forged in places most would never see. The kind of places where one shot meant the difference between an exfil or a body bag. There were fewer jokes now, fewer sideways glances. No more casual dismissals or names muttered under breath. Even the ones who had mocked her just days before kept their distance. Not out of fear, though some might argue otherwise, but out of respect born too late. They didn't know the whole story. They didn't need to. The shot had told enough. Her place on the base had shifted in a way that couldn't be written into rosters. She still showed up early. Still stayed late. Still walked the same dirt with the same boots and the same quiet purpose. But now when she passed the armory, the techs gave a nod. Quiet. Genuine. When she stepped onto the range, the instructors didn't question her role. They simply adjusted. The Special Forces sniper who had challenged her returned to his drills. But his sessions took on a different intensity. He reviewed his own long-range work with a sharper eye, rechecked every calculation, remeasured every factor. Not because he was embarrassed, but because he had witnessed something rare, something that stripped ego bare and left only truth. He started spending more time at the edge of the range, where the serious shooters practiced, where there were fewer eyes and less noise. Occasionally, he glanced toward the far platform where she sometimes stood, unmoving, hands behind her back, simply watching. She didn't claim any new titles, didn't step forward to lead. But things began to shift regardless. When a young recruit was caught mishandling his rifle, it was her quiet correction that carried more weight than the instructor's voice. When a wind pattern disrupted a training exercise, it was her brief note that saved the next group hours of wasted time. She never taught officially, but people began to learn from her anyway. Word of the shot reached beyond the base. Sniper schools in other regions picked it up. Conversations began among instructors who had once believed 3,000-yard hits were only viable under laboratory conditions. Some asked for data. Others asked for a name. They got neither. All they received was the footage, blurry, heat-distorted, but undeniable. One shot, one impact, one figure standing up slowly as the dust settled. She had no social media, no call sign painted across a rifle, no patch proclaiming her rank. But those things didn't matter anymore. Her reputation no longer existed in the places where noise and self-promotion thrived. It lived in silence, passed from one marksman to another in low tones. Her name wasn't etched in stone, but in the way others spoke when her presence was mentioned. A legacy not demanded, but given. The new recruits, wide-eyed and eager, would eventually hear the story. It always started the same way. About a girl who used to pick up brass, unnoticed, unarmed, unacknowledged. Until the day a sniper challenged her from 3,285 yards, and she accepted. Not for glory. Not for defiance. But because she knew exactly who she was and always had.